Hi, everyone. It's nearly 2 minutes past, so we'll start. Welcome again this morning to the webinar, and thank you very much for being here. For those I've not met before, I'm Gina Dennett, and I'm a Compliance and Student Protection Manager here at the OFS. And from the OFS, also today we have here Jack Smith, Head of Student Outcomes and Pathways, who will be taking us through the presentation today. We also have Kirsten Fisher and Lee Shotton, who are senior officers here at the OFS, who will be coordinating your questions to make sure we get through as many as possible. And we have Alison Brunt, Head of Institutional Performance Measures in our Data and Insights team, and Ed Cross, a Senior Analyst in our Data and Insights team, and members of our events team are here on the webinar too. So before we get started, just to point out some housekeeping notices. In front of you, you should see a Q&A function, a chat function, and a CC icon. Please use the Q&A function to ask us a question. Those will go straight through to Kirsten and Lee, who will put them forward in sequence to be answered. We did receive some questions in advance that we think we've covered in the presentation, but if not, then please do put those in the Q&A as well. If there are any broad questions which apply to all providers that we can't get to today, we will look to post additional information on our website answering those questions after the webinar. Please use the chat function to speak with our events staff. So for example, if you have a technical issue or any sound quality, please use the chat function to go through to our events staff. And please use the closed captions, the CC icon to access closed captions. And please note that the OFS don't generate these. These are generated automatically by Zoom. So apologies if there are any errors or anything unexpected. If you're having any problems using closed captions, please do put that in the chat. To confirm that we are recording the webinar and it will be available on our website later this week. So I'm now going to ask Dawn to start the presentation. And move on to the next slide. Thank you, Dawn. And I'm going to begin by giving a summary of the session. So today's session aims to focus on implementation. All the details of the outcomes of our B3 consultation are available on our website, and the link to that will be posted in the chat. Today, we're going to talk about the revised condition and how it operates, how we will prioritize providers for assessment, and at that point, we're going to pause for some question and answers. Then we're going to talk about what this will mean for you if you were selected in terms of engagement and assessment. And we'll pause again after that for some more Q&A. And then finally, we're going to do a reminder of what's in the data dashboards and what further resources are available. Today's session is pitched at a broad overview level, and you may have more detailed questions about the general approach in your specific case. We won't be able to answer provider-specific questions today, but you can email us on regulation@officeforstudents.org.uk, and that address will be available in the chat, and that will come straight through to us, and we can discuss any provider-related questions there. If you have specific questions which are not so much about our approach, but are about interpretation of your provider's data, you can email providermetrics@officeforstudents.org.uk, and we will also post that address. I'm now going to hand over to Jack Smith to take us through the presentation.
Hi, thanks, Gina. Welcome, everyone. It's really pleasing to see some familiar names in the attendees list, but for those I've not met before, I'm Jack Smith. I'm responsible for the development and implementation of our approach to regulating student outcomes here at the OFS. So as Gina said, we're going to run through a broad overview of our approach today. And to start that off, I wanted to take a quick look at part of the condition itself. So Dawn, if we could go to the next slide, please. So on the screen now, you've got an extract from our condition. And just a reminder for everyone, the condition is now in force. It's part of the regulatory framework. And if you haven't already, I would encourage you to go and look at the condition itself and Regulatory Advice 20, both of which are there to help you understand how the condition operates in practice. This session today is going to be about the practical effects of the condition. So I wanted, before we started, to remind us of a really important aspect of the condition. And that's that if your performance for any indicator or split indicator is above the threshold, then we consider that you're delivering positive outcomes and that you're compliant. So just a reminder that all performance above the threshold we will consider compliant. If your performance for any indicator or split indicator is below the threshold, then we think that you may not be delivering positive outcomes. But in order to understand whether that's the case or not, we need to conduct an assessment first. So that means that even if your performance is below a threshold, if we haven't conducted an assessment, you are not non-compliant with the condition. And that's what we said alongside the dashboards when we publish them. And that information is there for anyone that's using our data. So in practice, this means for most providers, for most indicators, you should consider that you're compliant with the condition, because that we know that for the majority of providers, performance is above thresholds. So Dawn, can we go to the next slide, please? Before we dive into the important stuff about how this is going to work in practice, I just wanted to set out why we were introducing this revised approach in the first place. And that's because we think that the approach of setting minimum expectations protects students, we think it protects taxpayers, and we think it protects the reputation of English higher education. And these policy objectives are what feed into our thinking about how we implement our approach going forward. So when we start to think about the choices we're going to make in implementation, it's these things that we hold in our mind as we do that. Dawn, if we can go to the next slide, please. So you've got a expected timeline on your screen. Just wanted to give you a quick update on where we're at. So we published data and thresholds in September. The initial ongoing condition came into force in October, on the 3rd of October. And now we're in the third bullet in November. And you've had the condition itself and your data for a month now. The first thing to say is that we're expecting to set out our prioritized categories in the next 2 weeks. So you can expect to have those by mid-November. We'll then begin the process of selecting and notifying providers. The remainder of the slides that we've got here are about these steps. But before we move into that, I just wanted to note that the cycle that we're using this year, so notifications in around November, is because it's the first year of implementation. We expect that normally we would be notifying providers in the summer each year. We think broadly that might be around June, but we just need to work through the data sequencing. We'll confirm that as we go into next year. And there will only be one cycle of B3 assessments each year. So it will usually fall into a regular sequence of that happening in the summer each year. And what we expect to be doing is publishing the outcomes of previous assessments as we go. So you can start to build that understanding of how the condition has operated in practice. Dawn, if we can go to the next slide, please. So really importantly, we know that there are more providers with more indicators and split indicators below the threshold than we can assess each year. And that means that we expect the publication of the thresholds and the data dashboards themselves to have a positive effect on student outcomes. We think providers will look at performance where it's below threshold, understand that performance, and seek to improve it. But each year we will select a certain number of providers for detailed assessment. That number might change each year depending on OFS resources and priorities. In the consultation, we said that this year, so in 2020, we would select up to 20 providers. So that's the group that we're going to be talking about largely today. The first thing that we'll do is set the prioritized categories, and you can see the things that we'll set as part of that on the left-hand side of your screen now. When we do that, and that's what we expect to do in a couple of weeks' time, is we'll tell you the indicators and split indicators that can be prioritized for assessment. This will mean you'll be able to identify whether any of your indicators or split indicators fall into the prioritized category for the year. And then from that pool, we'll select the providers. So in order to be assessed this year, you will have to have an indicator or split indicator in the prioritized categories that we've chosen. So for many providers who have indicators and split indicators below threshold, you may not be in that pool, and therefore, even though you have performance below threshold, we won't be undertaking an assessment this year. When we come to choose which providers to select, we'll make that decision using the factors on screen. And of course, as with all of our decisions, we'll take into account our general duties, which include things like promoting quality, value for money and effective use of resources, and proportionality. So we'll take those general duties into account, and we'll also have regard to our statutory duty to consider guidance from the Secretary of State. For those of you who haven't seen the most recent Secretary of State guidance, it's available on our website. It's still in force, and that includes some direct commentary on the areas that the OFS should consider looking at in relation to B3. We're going to talk next about the process, about what happens once a provider is selected, but we're going to pause at this point just for an opportunity for any questions that may have come up. So I don't know if we can go to the next slide. And Gina, I don't know if we've had any questions come in yet.
Hi, Jack. Yeah, there are some questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to go to those. First question is linked. Can you please explain the impact on new APPs will have on our existing ones? Clearly, we need to honour all commitments under our current APPs, but will we be expected to transition our current APPs to the new ones, or will we operate two in tandem for the duration of the life of each respective APP? How will it work in practice? And the question is clarified, I know not relevant for today, but an area where I would welcome clarification.
Okay, so that for those who aren't aware, the approach to access and participation plans under consultation at the moment, that consultation is closing shortly, and the precise steps that the OFS will ask providers to take will depend on the outcomes of that consultation. So you can see in the proposals that are on our website at the moment what we're setting out now, and in order to answer the specific question, it would depend on the commitments that you've made. So if you want to talk about APP issues, I'd encourage you to get in contact with our access and participation team. And I think the email address for that, we can post it later, but I'm pretty sure it's app@officeforstudents.org.uk. They'll be able to help with that.
Thanks, Jack. The next question is, will the OFS be monitoring instances where indicators move from below threshold to at or above threshold between years, e.g. to determine whether there are genuine improvements in learning and teaching versus the risk of providers lowering academic standards to allow more students to continue and complete?
Yeah, that's a really important question. So we considered this in response to the consultation, and our starting point is that providers in the sector are required to meet minimum requirements around quality and standards, and we wouldn't expect any provider clearly to make those changes. Our monitoring processes will work in two ways. So in relation to B3, you can see that when we select providers, we can consider distance from threshold and the students who are affected. The other element that we have in our quality and standards regulation is around the other B conditions, where we use data to inform the choices we make about whether to investigate providers or not. So the answer is yes, we will be monitoring data, and yes, we'll be looking at changes over time, and we will want to look at any significant changes to recruitment patterns or course delivery and understand that as we start to select providers for further engagement around B3 or the other B condition.
Thanks, Jack. The next two questions I think we'll be covering in the next section. Just to clarify, they are what happens with providers who've not been selected from the pool, and I think that's that in there. Yeah, so what happens with providers who've not been selected in the pool, we'll be coming on to, won't we?
Yeah, I've got a slide on that.
Yeah. So the next question is there an indication of how many outcome measures may be chosen as priorities?
So we haven't made that decision yet, and that's the decision we're going to publish. Clearly, it's of significant interest to everyone. So I would, in terms of what we can think about now, so we've said we'll take up to 20 cases. So there is a limit on the number of indicators and split indicators that we could pick up through that number of cases. So we'll take that into account. We'll also take proportionality into account and where our regulation can have the greatest effect. So those are things that we will consider. And when we publish those prioritization categories, it'll be really clear about the indicators and split indicators that we're going to take into account and which outcome measures will be included.
Thank you. And then we've had a 1-minute warning. So last question for this section for now. Will prior history and performance in other conditions have any impact on who will be prioritized?
So in terms of compliance with B3, one of the things that we set out in the consultation was that performance in relation to B3 in the past is not a compliance history matter that we'll take into account in relation to the revised condition going forward. So if you've engaged with OFS about your performance under the old ongoing condition B3, that's not something that we would take into account in selecting providers this time round. Your wider compliance with conditions of registration is something that we would want to balance when we came to selecting providers, but it's not a factor in choosing the prioritized categories. So if you the prioritized categories are about the student outcome measures, so whether we choose continuation, completion and progression, and the modes and levels of study, so whether that's full-time, whether that's first degree, whether that's a different combination, it's those things that we will be setting out in the prioritized categories, and that compliance history wouldn't come into effect. And like I say, for the original B3 condition that's been revised, any compliance history in relation to that is something that we wouldn't take into account in selecting providers.
Thanks, Jack. Okay, I think we'll come back to question and answers again, but I think we can move on to part 2 of the presentation now.
Great, thank you, Gina. So Dawn, if we can pop on to the next slide. So this section is about what's going to happen in practice. So what happens if you get selected? So if we could skip to the next slide, please, Dawn. So really important document, Regulatory Advice 20. We've posted the links. As I talk through this, you'll see if you open that document up, we're talking about the process for making decisions about ongoing monitoring here. So if you are in the document, then you want to look at the information that starts on page 7, paragraph 35. That's that's our kind of our textbook for going through this. So what we do once we set the prioritized categories is we select providers and we set a scope for assessment, and then we follow a 4-step process. We really encourage people to read Regulatory Advice 20 in that section I've just pointed to, because that's the information that sets out the process in detail. What we're going to do now is work through each of those steps. So Dawn, if you can go to the next slide, please. So once a provider is selected, we'll set the scope of assessment. And what we mean by scope of assessment is that a provider can be selected for the prioritized categories. So let's say we select full-time first degree, continuation as the indicator. So if you had performance below threshold in that indicator, you could be eligible for selection. We would then choose a group of providers from that pool, and for each of those providers we need to make a decision about the scope of assessment. For those of you who read through the consultation, you remember that one of our proposals was about how we set that scope, and the responses that we received is that it kind of depends on the provider and the circumstances. So we have a case-by-case approach to setting the scope of assessment and the outcome, but there are 3 possible outcomes. So if you're selected and it's for one indicator, we could simply do an assessment on that one indicator. However, say that indicator was around continuation, we could expand the scope to be all indicators or split indicators below a threshold for continuation, or we could expand it to include all your indicators that are below a threshold. And the reason why we're taking that approach is depending on the provider's performance and depending on proportionality and regulatory burden that would be in place, the answer for how wide we want to spread that net would be quite different. So you can see that for one provider where they had 2 indicators below the threshold, one of which got into the selected group, it may be beneficial for us to choose both of those indicators so we can provide a judgment on all of the providers' performance that's below a threshold, and then there wouldn't be a need for us to have ongoing engagement in a future year. So those are the things we'll balance along, obviously, with our general duties when we're making decisions about the scope of assessment. Once we've made that decision, we will look at the existing information that we hold as the OFS. So that information is about the data that's in our dashboards. So we'll have a quick squiz at those later, but the actual performance plus information about context in terms of the size and shape dashboard. We'll look at information about benchmarking. We'll have regard to advice from our colleagues on interpretation of statistics, and we'll take a view as to whether we think that any of that context or any of that existing information justifies a provider's performance. So there is a possibility that you're selected, we do that initial review, and we take the view that your performance is justified by your context, and then we would write to you and say, we've done this first step, this is our view, and we intend to likely publish information about that so we can be clear on our dashboards that we consider your outcomes to be positive. If we complete that step and we think that we need further information, likewise, we'll write to your accountable officer, we'll tell you what we've done, and we'll say that we want to start the engagement step. So if we can move to the next slide, please, Dawn. So the engagement step is step 2 in the process in Regulatory Advice 20. We generally expect it to take about 4 weeks. We're open to conversations about the length of time, in particular where things are falling in a particular academic year, and the complexity of the scope of the assessment. So there's no cutoff here. We're just trying to give a sense of how long this might take. And what we will do is invite you to submit information that's relevant to your context or to your performance, and more on context in a moment. That engagement will start with a letter to the AO. So it'll be a letter that comes from my team to the accountable officer setting out what we've done. The whole process may only be in writing. So if there's clear information and you send it back to us and we can make a judgment, it may only be in writing, but obviously there may be a need for conversations between us or opportunities to have that conversation. So we'll conclude that engagement step where you send information to us and we'll review it. And at the end of this stage, we could conclude that, again, you're delivering positive outcomes and that performance is justified, and that we're going to take no further action. Again, we would write to you and confirm that and give details of what we intend to publish. Or we can move on to the next stage, which is the first of the formal stages. So Dawn, if we can move to the next slide, please. I talked about context and the things that we'll take into account. It's really important that everyone's clear about what we mean by context in this process. And again, I would encourage you all to look at Regulatory Advice 20. If you haven't seen it already, Annex C has the list of contextual factors that we'll take in, that we're likely to place weight on. I just want to be really clear. This is a non-exhaustive list, and we will place weight on any relevant information that you can supply. So if the reason why you think your performance is positive or our data doesn't reflect positive performance isn't on our list, that doesn't mean we won't place weight on it. We want to consider all relevant information, but what we're trying to do here is give a sense of those things that we're more likely to place weight on. There's 2 broad categories: things that explain or justify the performance in the past, so the historical performance and actions that a provider's taken. We generally expect through the engagement process that we would have information from providers about both of these things, but there's no reason for that to be the case. If you were selected, you could simply choose to provide us information on one or more of the contextual factors listed out here. So that's what we mean when we talk about context, and it's important that and helpful that you're clear about that. So I would encourage everyone to go and, as I say, have a look at that Annex C. It was included in the consultation document, but Regulatory Advice 20 is significantly shorter. So so it's there to be helpful in that conversation. So Dawn, if we could move to the next slide, please. So this is the next stage is the more formal stage of the process. So step 3 in Regulatory Advice 20, and it has the 3 parts that are set out on the screen. But I wanted to just really make clear to people that the first step, provisional decisions, is a formal process, but it is not a final judgment. It is the OFS setting out our understanding of the position, our reasons for a conclusion that your performance is not justified by context, and the evidence that we've considered in making that judgment. So that will be us at the end of the engagement period, if we're not satisfied, telling you the reasons why and setting out the evidence we've used. What we expect providers to do is make representations to us if they wish to about that. Though that can be about the accuracy of the information we've used, that can be about the interpretation of the information we used, and we expect written representations of this process. But the point is to test the basis on which we're making our judgments, and that means that that there's 3 possible outcomes from the provisional decision and representations process. One is that we could conclude that you actually are delivering positive outcomes and are compliant. So that is absolutely still a possibility at this stage, and that may be based on additional information that you've provided in the representations process. We might amend our thinking and our reasoning. So you share some stuff with us during the representations that changes our thinking, but we nevertheless conclude that we think you're still not delivering positive outcomes in one area, in which case we would reissue the provisional decision and the clock would start again. Or we could conclude that you're not delivering positive outcomes, and that's when we move to our final decision. The representation stage on each provisional decision has to be a minimum of 28 days. So that you would have that for the middle section. And as I say, if we did multiple provisional decisions, the clock would start again. Dawn, if we can move to the next slide, please. So if you had a final decision that we considered that you weren't delivering positive outcomes, we would also think about the regulatory interventions necessary to mitigate that risk. What you've got on screen is the list of possible regulatory interventions, and I wanted to be clear today that this is set out in the consultation responses and in the regulatory framework more generally, but our approach is escalatory. So we don't always need to follow a sequential path through this list, but we do expect to take the least intrusive action that will effectively mitigate risk first. And what we've said in the consultation is that in this first round, we expect to use improvement notices via specific conditions as the tool to do that. What an improvement notice will say will be developed depending on the specific cases, but we anticipate that it will set a time frame for improvement, to be clear about what that improvement is required, and set in place any monitoring arrangements that we want to see. But we normally expect to publish those improvement notices, but that would be the extent of the intervention, and clearly the timescale for those improvement notices will depend on the indicator. So we might expect providers to be able to make improvements in relation to continuation faster than we might expect them to be able to make improvements in relation to part-time progression, for example. So if we can move to the next slide. And I want to move on to questions because I'm sure people have a lot of questions about the process. But I did just want to wrap up what happens if you're not selected. So with the prioritization categories, that we'll put in place, it will be clear to a group of you that you won't be selected in 2022 because you don't have any indicators below the thresholds in the categories that we've provided. What that means is you don't need to have any formal engagement with the OFS during the assessment cycle. Although I should say, as Gina said at the top of the webinar, please do get in touch with us if you want to understand how the process works, or if you want to understand something about your data, or having reviewed the information you've got further questions. We absolutely want to engage with you on those points and understand and help develop a shared understanding of that. But what we're saying is that there's no formal requirement to do that. There's no additional monitoring. There's nothing else that we need you to send to us. So even if your performance is below a threshold. But what we would expect providers to do, and we know through consultation responses that providers would be told us they would be focusing on this as a matter of course, is considering the data around student outcomes and identifying those indicators and split indicators below thresholds as part of those usual quality processes. The one thing that I wanted to finish this slide on was that if you do identify performances below a threshold and you think that it's necessary to make improvements or changes to your courses, then as part of that conversation, clearly it's going to be important to consider those contextual factors that I talked about earlier, because what they do is they talk about the things that we might place weight on in future. One of those things is that if a provider is taking credible and effective and sustainable action to improve outcomes, that is something that we are likely to place weight on. And we set out in Regulatory Advice 20 some of the things that we might expect to see in terms of that action. For example, we do set out where we might place weight on a provider taking action to close courses. So what we say there is that we're unlikely to consider that action to be positive unless students are supported and unless you've considered any lessons from that underperformance that you can apply elsewhere in your provision, and that you haven't simply sought to reopen those courses under a different guise or a different name. So that information will be really helpful in terms of thinking about actions that you might take. And likewise, there's some stuff in there about the action planning that we might expect to see providers undertaking. So at the end of the seminar, today, we're going to run through just a quick recap of the resources that are available, but we can pause now and hopefully we've got plenty of time for the questions that have been coming in.
Great, thank you, Jack. Yes, we have plenty of questions. So we have some technical questions, as well as some questions about timings and publication, and questions about the assessment process. So a couple of technical questions, which I've had some answers as well from data colleagues. It's probably easiest if I read those out and then see if you, Jack, or our data colleagues have anything to add. So the first question is, please could you explain what you class as a positive graduate outcome? So just to say, so from table 12 in our indicators description document, which is one of the links that we've put in the chat, it's page 40 of that document will be helpful. Broadly, any activities involving employment, paid or voluntary, for an employer or self-employment, as long as it's managerial or professional employment. Also, any further study, traveling, caring, and retirement. In all cases, it's activities the graduate reports that they're engaged in at the survey census date. Is there anything to add to that, Jack, or data colleagues on the call?
No, I think that's super helpful. I would, it's helpful to flag that technical descriptions and methodology document. It's a really helpful way of understanding the outcome measures. So if you hadn't had a chance to look at that, please do. There's also help guides on the dashboards themselves. So if you're using your dashboards as the way in, there's also ways to get to that resource there.
Great, thank you. The next question is, in the numerical threshold values, which group would providers be in who offer HND courses and also top up one-year courses? So HND courses are classified as other undergraduate, and top-up courses where students are topping up from an HND to a first degree would be classed as first degree. Anything you want to add on that? No, okay. So the next question is around, we move on to questions around prioritization. Is there an indication, I think we've covered that one. It's how does the OFS decide which subjects to focus on in any year? I think we've broadly covered that.
Yeah, it's worth just reflecting. So what's the, if you look at the categories in the so in RA20, if you've got that open, you're looking at paragraph, the yellow box underneath paragraph 36 has got the list of things that we'll take into account when setting that. Clearly, what we're interested in is addressing where we think there's the highest risk to students. So that's one of the things that we'll be looking at when we make our judgments. I've seen a couple of questions about Secretary of State guidance and the particular guidance that's in there. So we have to have regard. We've got statutory duty where we have to have regard to that guidance. That doesn't mean we have to follow it to the letter, but it does mean that we have to pay regard to it. And that guidance says that the Secretary of State would like us to focus on larger providers offering degree courses, and they list a couple of subjects in that guidance, so we'll have to have regard to that. But those are the things that we'll take into account. So risk to students and taxpayers and Secretary of State guidance as part of our general decision-making process. And say those will be coming out in the next 2 weeks. So you'll be able to see at that point which subjects we've chosen, if any.
Thank you. Could you clarify that providers will not be in scope if their metrics are above the numerical threshold, even if there are splits below the provider's benchmark value?
Yes. So, and I saw a question from someone correctly checking that it's at or above threshold. Yes, that's right. Even if performance is below benchmark and you're above a threshold, that isn't in scope for B3. We will consider performance in relation to benchmarks as we think about context where performance is below a threshold, but not above. Clearly, that performance will come into scope for TEF assessments, but not for B3.
Thank you. And can you confirm that you will go, whether you'll go down to individual course level? This person's understanding of Regulatory Advice 20 was that subject level was as far down as we would go.
So it is, the data is only held at subject level. One of the things that will absolutely, seems to me to be relevant context is courses and how that provision is spread out within a provider. So I can see that in our data, we can see law courses at first degree full-time, and we may identify that there's performance below a threshold there. But the context that you might have is actually you run 2 campuses and performance in one is better than performance in the other. And that's absolutely something that we would want to think about in terms of our assessment and then also in terms of our regulatory intervention. So our data is held at subject level, and that's the entry into the conversation, but there will be things about your performance that you understand, and that's the point of the engagement. So it may well be that there's relevant information about the courses that are captured within that subject area.
Thank you. In terms of timings, is it likely to be the end of November that you will contact providers?
Yes, so we're gonna, once we've published prioritization category, we're gonna start the process of notifying providers. Clearly for some providers, there are many more indicators below threshold than for others. So there's some different levels of complexity there. That is our intention to try and do that before the end of November if possible, but there may be a couple to run over. So that's one of the things that we are working through at our end, is about a wider notification of whether we've finished notifying providers or not. So we're thinking about how best to handle that within the OFS, but I would expect that we would be contacting most providers by the end of November.
Thank you. When does an investigation start in relation to B3? Is it at the point of initial engagement from the OFS to a provider on any matter in relation to B3, or is there a specific point at which an investigation starts?
So that'll depend on the circumstances. So we will we'll deal with that on a case-by-case basis. It'll depend on the information we want to gather and the regulatory tool that we want to use. I'd remind everyone that an investigation, and we talked about this in our publication of information consultation, an investigation is the mechanism we use to gather and understand information about potential non-compliance. So if we use an investigation, that's the mechanism we're using. The assessment process that we'll use as part of any investigation like that is the one set out in RA20. So if you want to understand what the process would look like, you can look at Regulatory Advice 20.
Thank you. The next question is about the relationship with the TEF. It's how does the timing of this relate to TEF submissions, i.e. should a provider who's chosen for assessment still continue with the TEF submission? And if so, will the impact of this be considered carefully for small institutions who'll struggle with capacity with often the same person or people doing both?
Yeah, so the answer to that is yes to both. Obviously, there is a potential link here. So clearly, if a provider was found to not be delivering positive outcomes and was in breach of condition B3, that could have an effect on their eligibility for TEF. However, what I would say is that that eligibility decision is a separate decision. So what we would take into account is the nature of the breach and the extent of the breach and the provision that was covered. So we may, for example, be looking at providers' postgraduate courses which aren't in scope for TEF, and that would be something we'd want to consider. And then the question about how would we take that into account in terms of timing and sequencing, we absolutely would take that into account for smaller providers, although I would note that I recognise that that's not just a small provider issue, and that the information provided in the TEF submission and in B3 is likely to be similar for all providers. So we would discuss that through the engagement process, and that's one of the reasons why we've said that it's normally 4 weeks of engagement, but there is a possibility to extend that.
Great, thank you. A question about publication, and there are a few questions around this which I think can be broadly summarised as: will the selected providers the names of those providers be published, and would that be at the point that they are decided, or would that be after the assessment has taken place?
Okay, so we haven't made a decision about publication of the providers that are selected for assessment. Hopefully you'll be aware of the revised publication of information regulatory advice that came out in September as well. And that sets out the things we need to consider. And what we're doing is, once we've selected those providers, we'll think about whether we want to publish the names. At the end of the process, so once we made a formal judgment, wherever that sits, so if we go back to the slides there, we could find a provider is delivering positive outcomes really at any of the stages of the assessment process, or only at the end could we find that they're not delivering positive outcomes. At any of those points, our general policy is that we would publish named information about that provider in a way that's linked to our dashboards and also more generally available on our website. We think that's important because it'll help people to understand the general operation of B3. It'll help people to understand the specific information that's available for that provider, whether their performance is considered positive or not, and the actions that we're requiring them to take. So our general policy is that we would expect to publish all of that information, but as we set out in Regulatory Advice 20, that's taken on a case-by-case basis, and there are some things that we would take into account.
Okay, thanks, Jack. I'm going to move on to some questions about the actual investigations. So the first one is, how is the OFS ensuring transparency around its decision to investigate one provider over another in instances where both may have comparable performance within prioritised areas? how is it going to maintain confidence in this process if a provider's initial selection leads to a wider investigation when others with similar performance may not initially get selected?
So the first thing to say is, remember that for the majority of providers, for the majority of their indicators, there is no risk of selection because they're operating above that level, and that we have set the thresholds in relation to identifying the weakest performance in the sector. Where we set the prioritized categories, that will give a transparent view of the providers that are eligible for selection. And what we've done is publish the things that we're going to take into account. So there may well be providers where there is similar performance in a particular indicator, but that performance may affect different numbers of students, and we may have different statistical confidence in that performance. And those are the things that we would want to take into account. Ultimately, we will need to make some judgments about which providers are chosen, and we'll make that in line with the process that's set out in B3, and that's the rationale and reasoning for why we've made those choices. And as we come to publish outcomes in our regulatory case reports, we expect to talk about the reason why that provider was chosen as well. So in terms of the question about maintaining confidence and transparency, the process set out in Regulatory Advice 20 sets out how we will make those choices, and then we expect in general to publish that information at the end of the process.
Thank you. And next question is, how will you be conducting assessments where programs are delivered in partnership with other OFS registered providers?
Okay, so the first thing to say is that in the first year of operation, we state that broadly, we publish, the condition came into force in October, so you can expect that to be this assessment cycle and the next assessment cycle. We are not going to prioritise indicators in partnership arrangements. So we made that commitment in the consultation outcomes. We think that there's a necessary understanding of the data in that space to happen before we can actively regulate there. What we have said, though, is that a provider could be selected if they don't have DAPS. So if you validate or subcontract with a provider that's selected, then there is a possibility that we engage with you as part of that process. But what we won't be doing is selecting partnership arrangements for those bodies with DAPS or with DAPS who are contracting with other partners.
Great, thank you. Is it possible that a provider could be chosen for both quality and standard subject interventions and B3 investigations, which is potentially a lot of burden?
Yeah, so in terms of selecting providers, one of the things that we have to have regard to is our general duty around best regulatory practice, which clearly takes into account proportionality and burden. And that would be something that we'd need to consider. We haven't made those selection decisions yet. So that is something that's to come, but I would point the person that asked the question to that particular general duty, because that seems to me to be really relevant in that consideration.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to move on a little bit to talk onto questions around the interventions. Somebody's saying they missed what we said about improvement notices. Can you confirm how they fit in with the schedule of penalties?
Yeah, so an improvement notice is it's a specific condition. So it's the first in that list. If you want to know a bit more about what improvement notices are, we've set out the details in the consultation analysis response. But in short, what an improvement notice would be likely a public document that says we want you to improve from the current performance and sets a timescale for that improvement.
Thank you. And can you provide more detail on how you will decide which penalty to give providers who've been found to be below expected standards? You said it wasn't necessarily sequential, but how will this work when, for example, you're assessing more than one indicator value? I'm taking marker to mean indicator value, and they have different quality outcomes. Under what circumstances would you jump straight to more serious penalties?
So in all decisions about regulatory interventions, we have to take into account our intervention factors. So those are set out in the regulatory framework in paragraph 167, if you want to take a look at them. But there's a list of things that we take into account, which is about effect on students, the severity of the breach, the provider behaviour, and the actions that have already been taken. So those are all the things that we take into account. As I say, in the first year, our general policies that we expect to be using improvement notices in the first instance. So those matters are more likely to be relevant to later cycles, and in general our approach is escalatory. So I would normally expect us to be putting in place an improvement notice before we move to the more intrusive actions in the kind of the later points in that intervention slide.
Thank you. Okay, we're slowly over time on the Q&A, so we'll move on to the final stage of the presentation, but just to confirm that we will be able to run all these questions off, answer afterwards, and get back to providers if necessary, or publish some further information for broad questions that affect everyone, and we will do that. Thanks very much.
Great, thanks, Gina. So Dawn, if you can go on to the next slide. And whilst you're doing that, obviously, we're really keen to continue engagement with the sector on this. So if there's anything that you would find more helpful to have a more in-depth session with as a group of providers or through rep bodies, then we're absolutely happy to engage with that. So please do get in touch with us. We're keen to come and have those conversations. So Dawn, if we can move to the next slide, I'm just going to quickly run through as a wrap up the kind of the resources that we would expect people to be making use of as we move forward from here. So prioritization categories coming out in a couple of weeks' time, and your provider dashboards are the place to start comparing those prioritization categories with your own performance. In case you've not seen these dashboards, they're on our website. Blue lines are the threshold, black lines are the your performance, and the green bars represent statistical uncertainty. This is the overview page that you get to when you first come in, but if Dawn, you can skip to the next slide. There is a build a query section, which is designed to allow you to make choices about the data that you want to be shown. So you could, for example, use this slide to select the mode and level of study that's been chosen for that we've indicated in the prioritization category. You could look at statistical uncertainty, population size, and the step 8 shows you the split indicators. So for example, if we chose full-time first degree continuation rates in a particular subject area as one of the prioritized categories, you could use this build a query to bring up your data in that area and show you how many of your indicators or split indicators are above and below threshold. So that build a query is there to help you do that, and we would encourage people to use that. Dawn, if you could skip to the next slide for me. You can also just go straight to the really detailed, there's a detailed tab in our dashboards, and then you can use the information in the blue box at the top there to be selecting exactly the same information that I just talked about, but it gives you a bit more detail, and you can toggle things yourselves. So depending on your confidence with the dashboards, you can either use the build a query mode or the detailed view. And I would strongly encourage you to get in touch with us through Provider Metrics at the Office for Students if you've got any questions about how to use the dashboards and what those look like. I'm rattling through because we're running close to the end. So Dawn, if you can move to the next slide. I just wanted to flag for everyone, I talked at the top about when we were talking about step 1, they're using existing OFS information. One of the things that we use in that is our size and shape data. So on this slide, you can see the data for the whole sector, but you'll have one of these for your own provider, and it will allow you to see and allow us to see the kind of balance of provision, different provision types, different courses, length that you can see here, lengths of study and subject, but there's a lot more information, and it allows us to see both proportions and counts and entrance and qualifiers. So that's one of the things that we use as we start to think about which indicators we want to focus on, because it allows us to see kind of how widespread within your institution an issue might be. So that size and shape dashboard, if you haven't had an opportunity to look at it, is a really helpful one. And Dawn, if we can move to the last slide. So we've published, we've put these details in the chat, but just to remind you all once again, Regulatory Advice 20 is the core document for explaining this process. The indicator descriptions and definitions are a really helpful way to understand how those indicators are built and what actually counts positively in those. They are really helpful documents, not written solely for data specialists. They're written for everybody to engage with, and I would recommend having an opportunity to read through those. And if you have any questions at all, Regulation at Office for Students, and provide for general queries about the approach and steps we may take, or just generally how B3 operates, more than happy to answer any of those questions. And Provider Metrics will be there to help you with specific questions about making the dashboards work or about your own data. So if you have any questions, please do get in touch. Thank you for your time today. I hope you found it useful, and we will speak to you soon.